Hello everyone, today we are doing episode 4 of Steam Engines on the Great Northern Railway. To kick off episode 4, we are going back to some steam locomotives that I have talked about on my channel, but they were not really in depth. They are also my favorite steam engines on the Great Northern. Ladies and gentlemen, Steam Engines of the Great Northern episode 4, the S-Class 484s. In the late 1920s, the Great Northern needed a new fast passenger locomotive to pull their new main train called the Empire Builder. This was a first-class train that ran between Seattle, Washington to Chicago, Illinois. The locomotives they had at the time couldn't keep up with the new first-class service. The P2 Mountains had the strength, and the H-classes had the speed. However, they needed a locomotive that had a good amount of speed and power. In the beginning of 1929, they contacted Baldwin Locomotive Works to build some 484 Northerns. From April to May, they built 6 new locomotives designated as S1s, and they were numbered 2550 to 2555. When they were built, they had 250 psi boiler pressure, Walschaerts valve gear, 73-inch diameter driving wheels, and 28 by 30-inch cylinders. This gave the effect of giving the locomotives 68,466 pounds of tractive effort. With the engine and the tender combined, the S1s weighed 847,900 pounds. Like all Great Northern steam engines, they were painted in the GN's signature glacier green. A couple interesting features on them is that they had the air compressors on the front of the smoke box door. This meant that the headlight had to be placed lower on the smoke box, and this gave the engines an odd but a powerful looking appearance. The Great Northern ended up being the only railroad to have Northerns with their air compressors on the front of the smoke box. Like most Great Northern engines, the S1s had the iconic Bell Pair firebox. When the new locomotives were placed on passenger trains, they worked fine, but the GN found out they worked better on freight trains. When they were tested pulling freight trains, it was discovered that they could handle freights at a sustained speed for a long period of time. Plus, with their 73-inch drivers, they also found out that the engines were pretty fast hauling the trains. Realizing this, the GN would remove the engines from the Empire Builder and they were put on other passenger trains and freight trains. Many crews would say that the S1s were the best dual-purpose engines on the Great Northern. After the unsuccessful attempt of putting these new engines on the Empire Builder, the GM would go back to Baldwin and they wanted a new class of 484s strictly for passenger service. Between February and March of 1930, 14 new engines were built. These new engines had 200 psi boiler pressure, 80-inch drivers, Walschaerts valve gear, and 29 by 29-inch cylinders. These engines were numbered 2575 to 2588. Classified as S2s. These ended up being the last steam locomotives bought by the Great Northern. Compared to the S1's tractive effort, the S2s were not that impressive. The S2s would have a tractive effort of 58,305 pounds. Pretty impressive for a locomotive built for passenger service at the time, but as you can tell, these things were not made to pull freight trains. The S2s were also around 100,000 pounds lighter than the S1s built before them. These new engines were also the first 484s to be built with 80-inch drivers. Like the S1s, they had the air compressors on the front of the smoke box. All but one were painted in the glacier green when first built. The 2577 would have a light gray boiler and cylinder jackets. Later on, it was repainted green like the other 13 engines. Unlike the S1s, however, the S2s had a radial style firebox which is uncommon for Great Northern steam engines. Both classes of locomotives would receive roller bearings, and some were given enclosed cabs in the 1940s. Originally, the Great Northern would use the S2s on the flat parts of the route, but they would later test the engines on some of their grades in Montana. In 1931, the Great Northern would take a S2 and run it between Havre and Whitefish, Montana on 1.8% grades. The test turned out to be pretty successful, and the Great Northern was now confident that they had the perfect locomotives to pull their empire builder. These locomotives were tasked pulling local trains, the first-class services, and fast mail service. Because of their 80-inch drivers, the S2s could haul passenger trains at speeds over 100 miles per hour. As good as these engines were, however, the S2s would be retired from the first-class passenger trains in 1949 when the diesels took over. The S2s would later be reassigned to secondary passenger trains and freight trains. Since the S2s had massive drivers, they were found to be very slippery when starting a heavy train. The crews of the locomotives had to figure out a method to use the engines pulling freight trains. The solution was the crews would keep a few pounds of pressure in the brakes, pull the throttle, then release the brakes, and they would give a kick to start the heavy train, and the engine would actually move better. This decreased the risk of having the engine damaging its tires and being put out of service. The retirement began with the first one retired in 1947. The 2581 would suffer a boiler explosion in January of the same year, and the engine was beyond repair and scrapped afterwards. Before the remaining engines were retired, they had their glacier green paint scheme replaced with the more economical standard black. The S-classes were retired between 1955 and 1958, and the last ones were cut up by 1963. Out of the 20 locomotives, one engine and one tender survives today. Number 2584 was retired in December of 1957 and put on static display outside of the Amtrak station in Havre, Montana in 1964. Number 2575 was scrapped in August of 1955, but its tender was spared and is currently being used behind Spokane, Portland, and Seattle number 700 in Portland, Oregon. Now, the reason why I wanted to make this video is because today is my 18th birthday, and I decided instead of doing a birthday video, I would do my favorite mainline steam locomotive for episode 4. Anyways, that's it for now. This is Brendan's Trains, signing off.